Hi guys, I'm going to go ahead and try again today to give you a lecture on the progressive era. All right. A lot of you were telling me that you had some issue, you didn't know or understand what I was asking you for in the Reform Mini project. And so I thought maybe being able to do your notes like we were at school would help you a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to go through this just at a normal pace. I'm not going to pause or slow down. If you need to pause the video to finish taking notes on a slide, you should do that. My cat is meowing in the background. All right, so let's talk about the progressive movement and what it is. Okay, the progressive movement is a period of social, political, and economic reforms in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Okay, this word right here, muckrakers. Okay, this is very important. This is part of your project, so I'd pay attention to this. All right, they were journalists who exposed corruptions in all the different areas: social, political, and economic. Okay, social meaning things to do with society, political meaning issues within the government, and economic, which has to do with the economy, obviously. All right, they wanted to point out that people were not doing good things, basically. They were abusing their power, and they were just doing some stuff that did not help the people overall. All right. Okay, so food and drug reform. This is one of your topics that you could have chosen for the Reform Mini project. Food and drug reform. It all started basically in 1906 when this guy, Upton Sinclair, you may have heard of him before, he wrote a book called The Jungle to expose some of the nastiness within the meatpacking industry. All right? It was super unsanitary. People were getting sick from meat because of all these new factories. There were no government oversights to kind of, control what the meatpacking industry was doing. People were working without gloves. It wasn't refrigerated. All this other gross stuff. Meat would be just sitting out on table. You can see here, people are just standing around. They're not wearing gloves or masks or anything. Just meat with these big knives cutting the meat. Okay. All right. This led government investigations, and it led to the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. All right. This set guidelines and created a process for federal inspection of the meat industry. So now the meat industry has to follow rules. Okay? They have to follow rules. They have to have like a checklist before they can start selling their meat to the public. Okay? Now this is overseen by the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, and they grade meat. Basically, so if y'all have ever bought steaks at the grocery store and it says USDA grade A beef, then you know that it has been graded an A by the USDA. It is a good piece of meat. And this was supported by my favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt. He was the first progressive president. Okay? Here you see some protesters. Housewise alliances demand proper inspection of meat. Okay? They're saying they were going to boycott meat and only eat fresh vegetables until they got proper inspection of meat. Okay? Moving on. Here you go. The Pure Food and Drug Act stopped the sale of contaminated goods. Now, you have to accurately label products. I'm sure a lot of you are eating a snack or drinking a soda right now or something. Look at the nutrition facts on there. That's there as a result of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which would eventually become the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. All right. It made it so that pharmaceutical companies, companies that make medicine or those kind of products, have to say everything that's in it, and they have to tell you how much to take, like tell you what the proper dosage is. And they have to tell you if it has stuff like alcohol or cocaine. Yeah. It's most people know that Coca-Cola, way back in the day, Coca-Cola was founded in 1896. Up until probably the early 1900s, Coca-Cola did have a dose of real cocaine in it. So, yeah, you could just go to the grocery store and buy cocaine. You do that now, you'll go to jail. All right. Okay, let's talk about environmental reforms. Here's the man himself, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a huge outdoorsman. He liked going outside. He liked hunting and fishing and hiking and all that good stuff. And he was a huge supporter of the conservation movement. The conservation movement helped protect natural resources and landscapes from extinction. Okay, he wanted to make sure that the land stayed preserved. So he set aside a huge tract of land in the American West, about 148 million acres, of forest to protect the wilderness and natural resources. These became national parks. This was the beginning of the National Park Service. Okay, the first appointment of land created Yosemite and Yellowstone National Parks. Okay, he preserved the Grand Canyon and other landforms and national monument sites as part of the Antiquities Act. Okay, government reforms. This guy, Lincoln Steffens. So if you're doing government reforms or voting reforms in your project, this is your guy. Okay, they wanted citizens to have more control over the government. They thought that the big businesses were controlling Congress way too much. If you remember the political cartoon from the robber baron activity, then you'll know that big businesses and the robber barons were kind of having a lot of influence over the national government. Okay, so these are things that they wanted. They wanted the secret ballot. Now, as a result of the secret ballot, you don't have to tell people who you voted for. Before, like I told you when we were still in school, that if when you went to vote, you would put a marble or a piece of paper in a huge glass jar for the candidate that you wanted in a lot of places. They wanted to create the initiative. This is a bill created by the people. So citizens can propose a bill to their government, and this is called an initiative. And a referendum is a vote on the initiative. Okay. A recall. So if you don't like a public official in your area, you can recall them. You can remove politicians by forcing them into a new election before the end of their term. Okay. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution. This was the direct election of senators. Now, during general elections, you vote for senators every 6 years in your state. Okay. Before, senators were appointed by the state legislature. All right. Progressives said that these would reduce corruption and give the people a greater voice in their government. It would reduce corruption and give people a greater voice in their government. All right, let's talk about labor and business reform. This doesn't look safe, does it? Look at this kid. He's just standing on a machine. He's not even wearing shoes. Definitely a hazard. He's like 8, working this big old machine. All right. The progressives wanted to improve factory conditions, reduce working hours, and end child labor. This kid was probably working 12-hour shifts 5 days a week with no shoes for like a dime a day. Doesn't seem fair. Because they're children and their brains don't work right, well, they work right. They're just not completely developed. Because they were children, they were often involved in serious accidents and had health problems as a result of their work. Some people said that child labor lowered pay for all workers because kids would take lower pay than adults. Because think about it, when you were a kid, if someone handed you a $10 bill, you thought you were rich. Now, a $10 bill won't really get you a whole lot of anything. And you realize that now because you're older. These kids would work for less, and they would work longer hours because they were just making money. All right? So, in 1916, the Keating-Owen Act prohibited transport of goods across state lines made by child labor. All right, well, that basically says, hey, yeah, kids can still work, but if these goods were produced by child labor, you can only sell them in your state. And that's not going to be very cost effective for the manufacturers. So that pretty much ended child labor. Child labor would be officially outlawed a few years after that. All right. This showed the government's attitudes toward business were moving away from laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term. It basically just means that the government will not interfere in the economy whatsoever. This did, however, set a precedent that the government needed to intervene in all sorts of social issues. They're now expected to intervene in social issues. Whereas before, the government's job was to make laws, provide public goods, and protect the citizens from foreign attacks and criminals and that sort of thing. Okay? Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell, you probably remember from the robber baron reading. She was the muckraker that exposed John Rockefeller's horrible practices in a series of articles. If you remember correctly, John Rockefeller was the guy who was in charge of the Standard Oil Company. He was the richest man in American history. Okay, and he got that rich through some cutthroat business practices. He did not play fairly. Ida Tarbell's articles led to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned trusts and monopolies. This is still in effect today, so that's pretty cool, right? Okay. Moving on. Aid for the poor. This guy is a photographer. His name is Jacob Reese. A lot of these pictures are very famous. Okay. This shows how the poor were living in the early 1900s. They were bad. There weren't building codes in place. All right. So all these buildings might not even be stable. Those collapse in on themselves, and these poor people would probably be seriously injured or killed in these accidents. So this helped improve living conditions. His work helped improve living conditions. It led to laws that established building codes and stuff like that, social welfare programs, government housing, all sorts of stuff to make sure that the standard of living for even the poorest people in this country is better than other places in the world. Okay? All right, let's examine the roles of women in the reform movements. So let's talk about Jane Addams in 1889. She founded the Hull House. For those of you that have seen Hey Arnold, this was a settlement house. And Arnold lived in one of those houses, a boarding house. He lived in a boarding house in Hey Arnold. This was the first settlement house in the United States. It was in Chicago. It helped poor immigrants adjust and learn skills to get them out of poverty, especially women. Once they got out of poverty, they got a job, learned English well enough, they'd move out and get their own place, and they'd open up a room for another poor immigrant family. Okay? This idea led to the opening of these sorts of houses all over the country, and it drastically improved working conditions, housing, and education for poor people and immigrants. Okay? The people that were leading this effort were often middle-class Protestant women. Protestant being like Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian. Yeah. They led efforts to improve society. Child labor, women's suffrage, prohibition. They led all of these reforms. Okay? And they were successful in all of them. Child labor was ended. Women gained the right to vote. And prohibition went from 1920 to 1933. Okay? And that's going to be it for today. If y'all like this video, then maybe I'll post another one tomorrow or on Friday. Okay? Thanks, guys.